Well, you said before that the EBMT was founded in 1975, you said.
Yes,
And
that's right.
but during that time there were not not that many transplants performed in
No,
Europe. So
really not.
how did that come to foundation?
Yeah, you know, I was not among those who started the EBMT. I just want to point out that from the beginning. So I don't know exactly how they reasoned. But John van Rod, he was actually an immunologist in the Netherlands. He was very active in starting this. And then there was in Basel, they had started transplants very early. And it was Bruno Speck. He was at that time head of the hematology unit in Basel. And Bruno Speck, he made some of the very early transplants, particularly in chronic myelocytic leukemia. I heard him in a meeting where he had done several transplants in chronic myelocytic leukemia, but at the late stage of the disease, and results were very poor. So he didn't succeed very well at that time, but he built up in the 70s a unit for bone marrow transplantation. So he had started already late 60s, early 70s. So I think he was actually one of the key players there, John van Rod and Bruno Speck. But then also at Hôpital Saint-Louis, from where George Maté came, in fact, there was Elian Gluckman. And Elian Gluckman, very good person and have done many. She was the one who started cord blood transplantation later on at Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris. And she was pupil of Jean Bernard again, the same as George Maté, was also pupil of Jean Bernard. But Elian Gluckman continued when George Maté left. She was younger than George Maté. She had done in the 60s transplants at Hôpital Saint-Louis. So these three people, there might have been, I'm not sure about John Goldman, whether he was there from the beginning. John Goldman was at that time working at Hammersmith Hospital. He was not the head of the hematology unit at that time, but he was interested in bone marrow transplant, particularly in chronic myelocytic leukemia. So I'm not sure if he was among these persons, but it was Bruno Speck, Elian Gluckman, and John van Rod. And John van Rod then added Ferry Swan. Ferry Swan has not been very well known later on, but he became the secretary of the EBMT. He was the first secretary of EBMT. And he actually was the one, in my opinion, who started to build up the registry and the first patients. And he launched the paper stuff that should be filled in to be reported to the registry, which was created in Leiden, where it still is. So these people, in my opinion, were the one who started EBMT. So Bruno Speck became the president and Ferry Swan became the secretary. And so they started to join once a year in the Alps. And the idea was that you would work in the morning, ski in the middle of the day, and work in the evening. And I got to know about this 1975. So I talked with my friend called Gösta Gahrton, the transplant surgeon, and I said that we should, of course, be members of this establishment, the EBMT, the society, whatever you call it, the working group was it from the beginning. And so we contacted these people and we were welcome. And so we became a center that participated in this. That was, at that time, I don't remember about any bylaws or any constitution or anything like that. We just met. And the first time I was at an EBMT meeting was in the late 1970s. I'm not sure, it was 79 or 77 or something like that, in a place in the Alps that was called Sils Maria. It was in Switzerland because, of course, Bruno Speck, he was from Basel, and Switzerland was a place where we went. And how many were we? We were, in fact, 70 people at that time. So it had expanded a little, you know. And we were at the pension, a very nice one. We could all have rooms at that little pension. And then maybe there was some other Swiss people that were added. So the center core was probably only about 50 or something like that. And the key players there was John van Rod. It was a guy who would call Hobbs from UK. He was not among the founders, but he was very active in bone marrow transplantation. And it was a guy from Hammersmith, Ted Gordon Smith, who was in their plastic anemia business, and he had made transplant in a plastic anemia. Hobbs had made transplants in genetic disorders in children. And John van Rod, of course, was not a clinical person, but he was in the immune. He was actually proposed for the Nobel Prize several times because together with Dosset, who got the prize for the HLA system in 1980 already. But John never made it. I cannot tell why. He didn't get the prize, but he was very, very, very active in EBMT. So that was how I met these people, and I made a presentation there. Right, and then, of course, then we had skiing, and then we met each other in the evenings and so forth. And the following years, of course, everything expanded slowly. And there were more and more presentations, you know, and EBMT expanded. I had a picture once of how it expanded, but I don't have it anymore. But anyhow, eventually we became too many to meet in the Alps and go skiing. And one day, John Goldman, who was a big player in EBMT during many years, he had not been the president at that time. He asked me, he said, Gösta, do you want to be the president of EBMT? And I said, well, I'm not well known in EBMT yet, but why don't you try to be president yourself? And you no, I said, no, not yet, or something like that. And then, in fact, he probably lobbied. I don't know how he did it. But the next year, I was proposed to be president of EBMT. And in 1988, I became president. And at that time, one guy who was very important earlier, I don't know when he entered, I don't think he was one of the founders. That was Peter Ernst. And he was from Denmark and from Copenhagen. And he had started transplants very early to give, together with his boss, who was called Sven Killman. And Killman had worked in Brookhaven with a guy called Eugene Cronkite, who was very important in studying how cells went around in the body, particularly the neutrophils. And he had labeled them and so forth. No details about that. But anyhow, Killman, pupil Ernst, became the treasurer of EBMT. And he was treasurer already before me. And before me, a guy called Alberto Marmont from Genoa, he was like a field marshal, a tall person, a very nice person. So he looked like a field marshal, but he was not a very good administrator. So no, EBMT was still, I would say, not very much depending on the constitution. There was one, but it was not very good, I would say. We met, we were still meeting in the Alps, and my mom was president and Congress president in the Courmayeur, close to part of Mont Blanc, I would say, not far from Chamonix. I think that was one of the last meetings we could have in the Alps, because then actually EBMT just expanded. So Alberto would step down as president, and I became the president following Alberto Marmont. And I found out that there was actually no organization to speak about, no constitution that was valuable, and so on. So together with Peter Ernst, I started to redo the constitution of EBMT. Maybe that was my most important contribution to EBMT, because I think still there are some signs of the old constitution, although it has been rewritten several times since then. But Peter and I worked very hard with that. So we built the constitution on the centers, and it's still built on the centers. So center membership is a relatively unique thing for EBMT. Then, of course, you are an individual member as well, but it is a center that actually elect, at least it was that until recently. I don't know whether they've changed it now, but it was the centers that were the key bodies of EBMT. So that was what we did. And then we actually planned to have a EBMT meeting in Stockholm. And since I had rewritten the constitution at that time, it was only a 2-year mandate to be the president. And I thought that was too short time. So now it is I think if it's not been changed, it's 2 times 2 years. That's 4 years for the president usually. And although I then had the possibility to sit for another 2 years, I thought that since I had changed to a longer period of time, I should not sit this period myself. I was there only for 2 years, so I stepped down in 1990. And that meant that we had to have a new president. And whom did you think I would suggest? Well, I suggested, of course, John Goldman, who had suggested me before that time. And at that time, John didn't say no. So he became the first president that could sit for 4 years. And he became president in 1990. And therefore, I was not the president when we had the meeting in Stockholm in 1992. But I became the Congress president, and John was the president of EBMT. So the meeting, the EBMT meeting in Stockholm in 1992 was arranged by myself and Per Ljungman, who then had stepped up as an important player in my department and started to take care of many of the patients that were transplanted. He became the transplanter at the Huddinge Hospital. The Karolinska Hospital is not now called, because Huddinge merged with the Solna, so it's now one hospital. So that was, and that meeting, I think we were some 1,500 people at that meeting. So EBMT had really expanded at that time. And maybe I exaggerate a little, but anyway, it was expanding enormously. And I mean, then you have seen the enormous expansion. I have a little anecdote for my entering as president, before me and before Mammon, in fact, Ted Gordon Smith from Hammersmith had been the president. And in my opinion, he had not done very much for EBMT or to expand it or anything like that. But then I asked Ted Gordon Smith when I was elected, I said, what do you think I should do? What is the most important for me to act on for EBMT? He said, you should do as little as possible, then it will expand by itself. So that was the message that I did not accept, you know. But that was maybe it was right at this time, but you know, because it expanded nevertheless. But Ted was a very nice person. We had good relations, but he had a little different a philosophy that was a little different from my own. So anyway, this was in 1998. So well, that I think is as much as I can tell about EBMT. If you have not other questions.
What did you talk about during these early meetings? Did you try to establish studies, or did you just share experiences from your first patients, or?
Well, of course, the registry was enormously important, you know, it was one. But what I did, I think that is my main contribution. I, in fact, started the first randomized or actually study based on the availability of a compatible donor in multiple myeloma and EBMT. So that was going on, you know, as you might have seen for many, many years. The study where we made allogeneic transplants with reduced intensity conditioning in multiple myeloma patients. It was the first study in EBMT. They hadn't had randomized or based on availability of donors. But before that, I told you about the registry. The transplants in myeloma became very important, in fact. So the first article was published in New England Journal of Medicine, allogeneic transplantation multiple myeloma in 1990, I think, or 1993. Now I have forgotten the exact date. So we made an EBMT study published in New England Journal of Medicine when we had a relatively large material. And the thing that we showed was first what's now talked about a lot, and that is the importance of obtaining complete remission. Because those who obtain complete remission, perhaps you could expect it, but we showed it very clearly, were more frequently cured or long-term survivors. Maybe you should say that instead. So that was one of the big contributions, I think. And we published new data on that in Journal of Clinical Oncology also, and that was also registry studies. So the registry studies were very important. So, and after that, I started this prospective study that has been published and republished in both Journal of Clinical Oncology and Blood. So I think my main contribution to EBMT studies was actually in myeloma. That was, and it was first registry studies, and then eventually, when we had reduced intensity, it became this prospective study, because the early ones were not based on non-reduced intensity. It was full conditioning with 10 gray and lung chilling. So that is the answer to my contribution to EBMT studies. And I think that's it. I haven't done much more than that.
And during the 80s, did you, because the registry already existed, so you filled
Yes.
in the paperwork and sent it to the EBMT office to Leiden?
Yes.
Or?
Oh, yes. It was always, Leiden was always Simona Jacobelli. She was extremely important, and she's still there, you know.
Mm.
And she was important from the beginning in this study. In the earlier studies, I had a statistician myself, in fact, who was doing quite of the job. But Leiden was the key place for both the registry studies and for this prospective study. And Simona Jacobelli, I rate her very highly. She's very good. She's still very good, you know. And she was at that time, and she was the one who done all the statistics. Now there are other players involved, of course, but she was a key person.